Why did they look at her that way? Had felt it before, at other postings in other rooms. But in this briefing tent, surrounded by hardened Navy SEALs, the silence cut deeper than words. She stood at the edge of the table, her rifle case propped beside her boot, and for a moment it was as if she wasn't there at all. Their eyes flicked toward her, then away. A stranger, an outsider, a woman in a place where brotherhood had been built through years of fire and blood. She let them look. She learned long ago that arguments didn't win trust in rooms like this. Bullets did. But still something tugged inside her, a sting of doubt. The memory of her daughter's voice on the phone 3 nights earlier. "Mom, you're going again." That was the voice carried with her now. And yet, even as she stood in silence, she sensed something else in the air, something the briefing itself hadn't named. The way their commander's jaw clenched too tightly. The way the map had been folded and unfolded, its edges creased by nervous hands. She wondered, what aren't they telling me? What's waiting for us out there? The colonel's words had been simple, a high-value target coordinating roadside bomb attacks. Location, an abandoned chemical plant outside, but had spent years reading battlefields before stepping into them. And this one smelled wrong. Still, when the SEAL demolitions man cracked a joke about Marines always showing up late, only gave a faint smile. "Actions speak louder," she said quietly, and began assembling her rifle. No one answered. The desert never really slept. That night, outside forward operating base Falcon, the heat still radiated off the concrete as if the sun had burned its memory into the earth. Sat alone on a stack of sandbags, cleaning the long, heavy .50, her hands steady in the faint glow of a. The weapon was more than metal to her. It was ritual, control in a world that often spun beyond reason. Every swipe of the cloth down its long barrel was a reminder that precision mattered, that sometimes the difference between chaos and survival came down to one round placed in silence. She thought of again, 16 years old, eyes too old for her age, living back in Bear Creek, Montana. Her daughter believed she was away on a training rotation, had lied because truth was a weight didn't need. Not again. Not after losing her father to a drunk driver when she was 10. Closed her eyes, pressing cloth to steel. Please let me come back to her. But when Colonel Sharp's boots crunched on the gravel, the moment vanished. "Blake," the colonel said, "never they asked for the best. That's you, don't waste it." The words were meant as confidence but heard them as a burden. The best. What if she was? What if tonight was the one time her breath stuttered, her hand shook, her bullet missed? The mission should have been simple. A strike, in and out, precise as the clean snap of a trigger. But missions on paper never matched the battlefield. When they moved through the skeletal corridors of the chemical plant 3 days later, the night air was heavy with dust and old poison. Pipes groaned like voices in the dark. And that was when everything shattered. Gunfire from 3 sides, shadows erupting from cover, the trap sprung. Hit the ground hard, concrete biting through her knee pad. Her headset exploded with voices, curses, orders, panic breaking through professional control. "Static comms check," the SEAL commander, his usual calm fraying into raw urgency. "Negative, sir. We're jammed. Repeat, we're jammed." That was Lane, the comms man. And then's voice, ragged and almost human in its fear. "We're all dead." His breath caught. The words no one ever said aloud, not men like these. She had seen battle-hardened Marines joke about odds stacked 100-1, but she had never heard those words crackle through a net. For a second, the silence after felt heavier than the gunfire. And then lifted to her shoulder. The sound tore through the night like a thunderclap. A .50 caliber round ripping air apart. The recoil slammed into her, familiar, grounding. Through her scope she watched the insurgent commander's chest burst open, his body folding like a puppet with strings cut. For a moment the battlefield paused. The SEALs below, 5 men crouched behind crumbling concrete, looked up as though they'd seen a ghost, and in a way they had. "Holy shit," Ford, the demolitions man, his voice stunned. "That's Frost," answered, and in his voice heard something new, hope. The crack of her rifle echoed again. Then again. Each shot measured, each trigger pulled deliberate. The enemy advance faltered, fragmented. Exhaled slowly, adjusting her aim. This was why she was here. Not for glory. Not for the unspoken need to prove herself in a room full of doubting eyes. For this. To stand in the shadows and be the thin, unseen line between survival and silence. But even as her rounds bought them seconds, felt time slipping like sand through her fingers. She could hear it in his ragged breathing as he fought with a shoulder wound. She could see it in Burke, the seasoned chief, calculating their odds and finding none. She whispered into her mic, 15 hostiles still active, engines inbound, reinforcements. His good hand reached for hers when they finally pulled back to her position, his face pale, his jaw locked against pain. "You just saved us, Marine," he said. Squeezed his hand once, then looked back toward the shadows where more headlights bloomed. "We're not out of this yet." The truth was, she wasn't sure they ever would be. What she hadn't told them, what gnawed at her chest even as she steadied her scope again, was the secret she carried. The intelligence had been wrong. She'd known it before they stepped into the chemical plant. She'd intercepted chatter that the target had moved. She had reported it, and yet the mission had gone forward anyway. She hadn't said a word since, because admitting it meant admitting what followed wasn't bad luck but betrayal. Someone had wanted them here. Someone had wanted them dead. Now, with bleeding beside her and face flashing in her mind, wondered how long she could keep that truth buried. But there was no time. The second convoy was already arriving, technicals with mounted machine guns, dust clouds rising in the moonlight like the breath of the desert itself. Set her cheek against the stock of her rifle. For now she had one job, keep them alive. The reckoning for the ambush, for the betrayal, for the lies she'd told her daughter, would come later. If she lived to see it, how much longer could they last? That was the thought clawing its mind as she pressed her scope against her eye, searching the chaos of the chemical plant. The air smelled of rust, gunpowder, and heat, as if the whole structure itself was bleeding. The SEALs were moving toward her now, 5 shadows bounding across broken terrain, one of them slower, clutching his shoulder. Every step he took left a trail of blood darker than the night itself. Worked her bolt smoothly, chambering another massive round. She could feel the vibration of engines now, diesel growls carried on the desert wind. She whispered into her mic, calm despite the pounding of her heart, 3 technicals inbound, mounted weapons, heavy. Burke, the grizzled chief, didn't even flinch. "Copy, we'll hold what we can." Hold, the word echoed in his chest like a promise and a curse. The first pickup tore through the main gate, headlights glaring, a PKM heavy machine gun welded to its bed. Tracked the gunner in her scope. His confidence was visible in the tilt of his body, in the casual way he scanned for targets. He believed this fight was already over. His finger tightened. The roared and the gunner's body snapped backward, tumbling lifeless into the dust. The heavy weapon swung uselessly as the driver panicked, slamming the brakes. But the moment of victory lasted only seconds. Another truck pulled in behind, this one carrying fighters with an RPG launcher. His breath caught. If that warhead flew, cover wouldn't matter. "Second vehicle," she murmured. "RPG confirmed." "Options?" asked, his voice tight with pain. "1 shot, maybe 2. She lined up her scope. The insurgent shouldering the launcher had his face hidden by a scarf, his hands steady as he sighted. Inhaled, exhaled. The crosshairs kissed his chest. She squeezed. The recoil slammed into her, dust rising around her position. The insurgent collapsed, the RPG clattering harmlessly to the ground. "Nice work, Frost," Burke growled over the net. And though his tone was rough, there was something in it, respect she hadn't heard before. Almost smiled, but then a third truck arrived. This one carried something worse. A mortar tube. Her stomach tightened. Mortars meant death from above, death they couldn't see or stop once it started. "How long?" asked, reading her silence. "Minutes," Burke answered before she could. "If their crew knows what they're doing, we've got 5, maybe less." His hand brushed over the magazine at her side. 20 rounds left. Not enough. Never enough. She steadied her scope again. 3 men working methodically. One holding a round, another adjusting the tube. So calm, so certain of their kill. She heard his voice in her memory. "Mom, why do you always have to go back?" Whispered under her breath, not into her mic, not for anyone but herself. "Because if I don't, someone else's child doesn't get their mom back." She fired. The mortar leader dropped. The others scattered, scrambling for cover. Behind her, Ford's explosives detonated, the wall erupting into dust and fire. Concrete cracked open, leaving a jagged hole into the night beyond. "Go," Burke shouted. The SEALs moved, dragging with them, their silhouettes swallowed by debris and shadow. Fired again, covering their retreat, then rolled to her feet. The felt impossibly heavy in her hands, but it was an old weight, a familiar one. She ran. They spilled into the night, 6 warriors against the desert, and the world seemed to hold its breath. Engines revved behind them, headlights swept across the sand. 2,000 meters, panted, pointing. Bearing 140, dry riverbed Wadi, concealment. "Then move," Burke barked. "We're not stopping." The desert floor was uneven, littered with rocks that tore at their boots. Lane stumbled under the weight of his comms pack. Cox half-dragged, whose teeth were gritted against pain but whose legs refused to quit. Heard the rattle of machine gun fire, the buzz of bullets cutting the air close enough to feel. She dropped to a knee, fired, rose again without looking to see if her shot hit. At that distance, with that weapon, it always did. "Keep going," she hissed, her voice sharp, carrying urgency but not panic. The SEALs obeyed. But the engines were gaining. His eyes caught a ridge line to the left. High ground, cover, opportunity. "Burke," she called, "that ridge, I take it, slow them down." "No," snapped. His face was gray, his body half carried by Cox, but his voice carried command. "We stay together." "Sir, splitting their focus is survival," countered. "I can buy you time." Burke's silence said he agreed. Eyes narrowed, wrestling between command instinct and tactical necessity. Finally, he exhaled. "Fine, but you come back, that's an order." Didn't answer. Orders were for certainty. This was a gamble. She sprinted for the ridge. The climb burned her legs, every muscle screaming as she hauled thee in her pack. But when she dropped between 2 boulders at the crest, the world opened up. 3 technicals fanned out across the desert floor, headlights bouncing. Dust rose behind them like storm clouds. His hand steadied, her heart slowed. The familiar calm of the scope settled over her. The first shot crippled a truck, its engine block torn open, steam hissing into the night. Fighters scrambled for cover, their confidence fractured. The second truck turned toward her, its machine gun opening fire, tracers slashing the dark. Rock fragments exploded around her, stinging her face. She shifted, fired again. The radiator burst, smoke blinding the driver. "That's right," she whispered, "look at me." Her radio crackled with Burke's voice. "Halfway to the Wadi, keep 'em busy, Frost." She fired again. Fighters fell, not knowing where the death came from. But the third truck was smarter. It stopped short, its men dismounting, advancing in pairs, covering each other with disciplined precision. Not random insurgents, trained, military. Stomach knotted. Who are we really fighting? The SEALs were close to the Wadi now, but strength was failing. Could hear it in Cox's voice as he shouted updates, could hear the grit of determination holding them together. Then Burke's voice cut sharp through the net. vehicles east of the wadi, blocking positions. Blood went cold. The safe route was gone. The wadi wasn't sanctuary anymore, it was a kill zone. She scrambled from her ridge, sliding down loose rock, lungs burning. Ahead, she saw headlights converging, fighters moving into position, rifles gleaming under starlight. She raised her scope, 3 enemy positions covering her team. She had angles, she had shots, but not enough rounds. Negative, said immediately when she called it out. Too dangerous. There is no other way, whispered. Her first shot silenced a machine gun nest pinning Burke. Her second dropped a flanker closing on Cox, and her third she didn't take yet. She hesitated, because even as she lined up the fighter in her crosshairs, she saw his face. Young, barely more than a boy, fear in his eyes but discipline in his posture. She swallowed hard. Her finger tightened anyway. The fight blurred into chaos, gunfire, shouts, headlights cutting the night like blades. Dropped targets one by one, but her magazine was nearly empty. 10 rounds left, she whispered, mostly to herself. And then a new sound, not trucks, not small arms. Rotors. Froze helicopters, heavy, twin engines. She knew the sound, Chinooks, American. But in Iraq, American didn't always mean safe. Her scope caught the silhouette sweeping low across the horizon, door gunners visible, combat approach. Lane's radio sparked alive. They want us to pop smoke, red for friendly. His breath hitched. If they were American, it meant salvation. If they were, it meant slaughter. The SEALs looked at her, waiting. Even his face pale, his eyes fierce, deferred to her now. Her finger rested on the pin of a smoke grenade. For a heartbeat, she thought of again. Mom, do you ever get scared? Yes, whispered to herself, but I move anyway. She pulled the pin. Red smoke hissed upward into the night sky. The red smoke curled into the Iraqi sky, a fragile thread between salvation and ruin. His heart hammered as she watched it rise, carried by desert winds. Her finger hovered near her trigger. The Chinook banked, its massive body looming over them, rotors pounding the night into thunder. Door gunners leaned out, weapons trained, yet still not firing. Then a voice broke through Lane's headset, distorted but unmistakably American. Crossroad 6, this is 7-2. We see your smoke coming in hot. Relief surged through the team like oxygen. Ford muttered a curse that sounded almost like a prayer. Even Burke allowed a breath he'd been holding too long. But didn't let her guard down. Not yet. Something about it still felt wrong. Because if comms had been jammed all night, how had that transmission cut through so clean? The Chinook descended into the wadi, whipping the smoke into a storm of red. Dust and sand choked the air, stinging eyes and skin. The noise was overwhelming. Rotor Walsh, gunfire, the steady staccato of M240 machine guns opening fire on enemy positions. Move, move, Burke roared, his voice nearly lost in the storm. The SEALs half-carried toward the bird, Cox shielding his commander's wound with his own body. Ford had his last charges ready, tossing them in calculated arcs to cover their retreat. Lane stumbled but kept his radio clutched tight. Fired twice more, this thunder ripping across the desert. One round shattered an RPG team just as the warhead tipped upward. Another tore through the chest of a fighter sprinting to cut off Ford. She didn't check the kills. She didn't need to. She knew her bullets. Go, she shouted, her voice raw. I'll cover. Not without you, Burke barked back, but he moved, dragging Ford with him. Was last always last? She sprinted across the open sand, rifle heavy in her hands, rotors screaming above her. Bullets cut the night, close enough to tug at her sleeves. Then hands. Rough, strong hands yanked her into the belly of the Chinook, the metal floor slamming into her shoulder. The door slammed, the helicopter lifted, the desert fell away. For the first time in hours, allowed herself to breathe. Jesus Christ! The crew chief's words cut through the roar as he looked at the bloodied, dust-covered warriors sprawled in his cargo bay. You people had a busy night. Slumped against the netting, pale, exhausted, his sling soaked with fresh blood. That's one way to put it. Cox was already kneeling beside him, pulling proper medical gear from the kit. His voice was calm, but his hands moved fast. Clean through. Missed the artery. You'll live, sir, but that arm is useless until surgery. Grunted, trying to shift, his jaw clenched. I'll take useless over dead. Sat against the opposite bulkhead, her rifle across her knees. She could feel the adrenaline draining, leaving her body heavy, trembling. Her hands still smelled of gun oil and blood. Through the open door, she saw the desert rolling below, quiet, indifferent, as if it hadn't just witnessed the edge of hell. But couldn't quiet her mind. The jamming equipment, the perfect timing, the ambush that had known exactly where they'd be. This hadn't been luck, this had been betrayal. Lane adjusted his headset, scanning frequencies even now. His face was pale in the dim red cabin light. Signal strength was local, he said, almost to himself. That jammer wasn't far, a few clicks maybe. Burke was stripping his rifle, the ritual of cleaning grounding him in the chaos. Doesn't matter how close it was. Somebody knew exactly where we'd be. Somebody wanted us buried in that plant. Ford slammed a fist against the deck, his voice hard. Set up like rats, if I ever find the bastard who signed off on that intel. First we survive, cut in softly. Her voice was low, but it silenced the bay. Then we find who put us there. The words hung in the air, steady and cold. 20 minutes later, the crew chief leaned toward. Sir, Falcons on high alert. All flights diverted. We're ordered to LZ Bravo. Narrowed his eyes. Authentication. None, sir. Comms compromised, they say. The crew exchanged glances. Stomach dropped. Falcon compromised. Now, the timing was too precise to be coincidence. Colonel, Burke muttered darkly, we're walking into another trap. His mind spun. The ambush, the false target, now this. It wasn't over. Whoever was pulling strings wasn't finished with them yet. They diverted, but even as the Chinook banked toward an alternate airstrip, never lowered her rifle. Her eyes stayed fixed on the horizon, scanning for threats. Through her scope, she caught something that chilled her blood. Vehicle lights circling Falcon, moving in patterns she recognized. Not random patrols, not security, a containment grid. They weren't keeping enemies out, they were keeping people in. The decision came fast. They would land at an abandoned British airstrip, remote, forgotten, by war but safe enough for the night. The Chinook touched down. Engines whined, rotors chopped the night air. The SEALs disembarked, weapons raised, forming a perimeter even in exhaustion. Hit the ground first, leveled, scanning the horizon. The desert was too quiet. Lane unpacked salvaged British comms gear, coaxing life into dusty machines. His eyes widened. I'm getting clear signals. Martinez et al. She's asking for GPS and a sitrep. Looked at, do we trust her? His voice was steady, but her eyes betrayed the weight of the choice. Trust isn't free anymore. Not after tonight. Burke exhaled heavy and said what they all knew. Someone inside sold us out. Until we know who, we trust no one. And then came headlights. 4 vehicles on the horizon, moving fast. No flags, no markings, no hesitation. Positions, Burke barked, snapping his rifle up. Ford moved to set charges. Cox pushed against cover, his hands never leaving his commander's wound. Dropped prone, scope to her eye. Through glass she saw them, technicals. Fighters dismounting with precision, discipline, not militia, not insurgents, soldiers. Her stomach clenched, American contractors, foreign. One figure stepped forward, alone, carrying a white flag. His voice cut through the desert air, clear and commanding. Lieutenant Commander, I'm Colonel, Special Operations Command. We need to talk. His crosshairs stayed locked on his chest. Her finger never left the trigger. Because she knew, sometimes, the most dangerous enemies walked toward you with open hands. What did trust even mean anymore? His cheek pressed against the rifle stock, her crosshairs resting on Colonel's chest. He stood in the pale wash of headlights, hands visible, uniform crisp despite the dust of the desert. His voice carried authority. Calm, practiced. But authority was exactly what had almost killed them. Beside her, Burke's rifle barrel tracked the technicals. Ford hovered over his detonator, thumb itching for an excuse. Lane muttered into his headset, trying to filter static for fragments of truth. Cox tightened sling, his eyes never leaving the white flag. Everyone waited for. Because in that moment, it was words that mattered. It was whether she twitched her finger. Closer called, his voice raw but commanding. Unarmed, hands where we see them. Obeyed, each step was deliberate, measured. He stopped 50 meters away, moonlight painting the lines of exhaustion on his face. "Commander," he said, "there's been a breach. High level. Someone has been feeding insurgents information for months. Tonight's ambush wasn't chance, it was part of that leak." Silence pressed down heavy. Ford muttered a curse. Lane froze, headset slipping from his ear. Even Burke's jaw clenched, though his rifle never dipped. His crosshairs never wavered. Because words were easy, betrayal was easier. "How do we know you're who you say you are?" demanded. His voice shook slightly, but not from weakness. From the knowledge that if was lying, all of them were already dead. Reached slowly into his pocket, produced identification, orders, authentication codes only someone with clearance could know. Studied them by flashlight, his face shadowed but grim. Finally, he nodded. "He's real." Ford exhaled, muttering, "For now." But didn't lower her rifle, not yet. His words weighed heavier than the desert air. The breach traces back months, at least 17 missions compromised across provinces, 47 confirmed dead, dozens more suspected, all special operations. The silence after was suffocating. Stomach twisted. 47 names. 47 families waiting for letters that said killed in action when the truth was betrayal. She thought of again. What would the letter say if hadn't made it tonight? A training accident, a routine patrol, lies neatly folded in an envelope. Her finger pressed harder against the trigger, not to fire, just to feel the weight of choice. In the end, gave the order. They would follow, protective custody he called it, a secure facility off the books, safe. Safe, the word had lost meaning. Still, the team moved with practiced precision, covering angles, eyes sharp as they climbed into armored vehicles. Was last, scanning the horizon until dust swallowed the airstrip. The convoy cut through the night. Engines growled, tires bit into sand, headlights sliced darkness into pieces. Rode in the lead, Burke beside him, voices low and grim. Rode in the second vehicle, across her knees. The rifle was cold comfort, but comfort nonetheless. Through bulletproof glass, she watched stars blur above, endless and indifferent. Inside, silence sat heavy. Ford checked explosives by touch alone. Lane scribbled notes of intercepted chatter. Cox whispered updates on who drifted in and out, pale but unyielding. Closed her eyes briefly, hearing's voice again. "Do you ever get scared?" Always, she thought, but fear doesn't mean stop. The convoy arrived at dawn. High walls loomed from the desert floor, guard towers rising like watchful eyes. Fences layered with razor wire gleamed under floodlights. Soldiers in crisp gear manned checkpoints, rifles steady. "Station Phoenix," announced. "Officially, it doesn't exist." The gates yawned open. The convoy rolled through. Felt her stomach sink. Inside was order, too much order, guard rotations precise, facilities humming, communications arrays glowing, a compound built not just for defense but for control. Were they guests or prisoners? The SEALs were ushered into quarters. Comfortable, yes, but noted the details. cameras recessed in corners, locks that only opened from outside, guards always 2 steps behind. Cox escorted to the medical wing. The commander's face was ashen, fever threatening, caught his eyes as they wheeled him away. He gave the faintest nod as if to say, "Keep them alive. Find the truth." She set the beside her bunk that night, its presence the only thing that let her close her eyes. Even in sleep, her hand never strayed far. Morning came with fluorescent light instead of sunrise. Was escorted to briefing room, guards polite but armed, always armed. Inside, Burke, Ford, and Lane sat stiff at a conference table. The walls were plastered with photographs, documents, a sprawling timeline. Entered with files under his arm, eyes shadowed by fatigue. He gestured to the wall. "What you're about to see is classified above top secret. The breach isn't just about money. It's a network, sophisticated, designed to isolate and eliminate specific American personnel under the cover of combat." He activated a screen, diagrams lit up, nodes, names, arrows connecting missions to casualties. The scale was staggering. Lane muttered, This isn't insurgents. These are American systems, American protocols." "Correct," said grimly. "The network has reach inside our own intelligence agencies. CIA, contractors, even elements of state. It's not just betrayal, it's orchestration." Ford leaned forward, eyes hard. "So the plant wasn't bad intel, it was execution. We weren't meant to walk out." His jaw clenched. Her silence was louder than words. Because she'd known. She'd known before they even stepped into that hell. "Motives?" Burke asked, his voice low, dangerous. His answer chilled the room. "Not just money, political leverage, a demonstration, proof that America's most elite forces can be neutralized, not by enemy fire but by their own command secrets turned against them." His chest tightened. "What kind of enemy wears your own uniform?" Pointed to the timeline. "The ambush you survived was Operation Silent Thunder, designed to eliminate your team. We estimate nearly 100 American operators have died this way." The room went still. His hand brushed against her rifle case at her side, though she knew it was only instinct. You couldn't shoot betrayal off a screen. She spoke finally, her voice low, controlled. "Then what are we now? Guests, witnesses, prisoners?" Looked at her evenly. "Protected witnesses, but survival means staying here. The network won't stop, you've seen too much." Met his eyes. She searched for cracks, for lies, for anything human behind the steel. "And if you're one of them?" His expression didn't flinch. "Then you'd already be dead." The words were logical, reasonable, but had learned logic could be a mask. A knock at the door interrupted. A comms specialist entered, face pale. He handed a printout. "Intercepted traffic," he said quickly. "They're looking for the SEAL team, official channels, claiming rogue status, national security threat." Lane's head snapped up. "They're weaponizing law enforcement, hunting us with our own systems." Stomach sank further. First betrayal, now erasure. Burke slammed a fist against the table. "How long until they find this place?" His voice was grim. "Convoys already en route. Phoenix was never meant for a siege." His hands tightened on the edge of the table. So this was it, trapped again. Another fight, another promise of safety shattered. And once more she would be forced to decide. Stand and fight or vanish into the shadows. That night, as the compound braced for attack, sat on her bunk, across her lap. Her reflection in the rifle's steel caught her off guard. Dust still in her hair, dark circles under her eyes, the faint scar across her cheek from an old mission. She looked older than she remembered, more worn. But what frightened her most wasn't the betrayal, the ambush, or even the convoys rumbling closer. It was that she no longer knew who the enemy really was. She whispered to herself, voice barely audible, as if might somehow hear it across the ocean. "Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it just survives." And as the alarms began to wail, rose in hand, ready to face whatever came through the gates. Why did the alarms always sound the same? Had heard them in Kandahar, in the narrow alleys of Mosul. Different continents, different wars, but always the same shrill cry, metallic, unfeeling, warning you that death was already on the way. Station Phoenix erupted into chaos. Boots slammed against concrete floors. Radios barked clipped orders. Sirens wailed above it all. Outside, floodlights swept the desert, illuminating dust clouds growing closer. Sat on her bunk, across her lap, and for a moment she did nothing. She simply listened, because sometimes you could tell more from the tone of fear than from words. The soldiers running past weren't shouting like men who trusted their defenses. They were shouting like men already preparing to die. Burke burst into the barracks, rifle slung, face grim. Convoys, 24 vehicles minimum, 5 clicks out, estimated platoon strength. Friendly? Ford asked, though he already knew the answer. Burke's silence said enough. Rose, the heavy but familiar in her hands. What about air? Lane stormed in behind Burke, headset crooked, cords trailing. Air support's off the net. I've tried 6 channels. Someone's cutting us out again. Ford slammed his fist against a locker, the sound echoing. Same damn playbook. Jam us, isolate us, erase us. His voice cut through the storm, calm but sharp. Then we don't wait for rescue. We plan to survive. The others looked at her, and for the first time since the plant, no one doubted. They moved to the command room where stood over a map, jaw tight. He didn't look surprised by the approaching storm. Options? Asked from a stretcher in the corner, pale but awake. His voice was weak, but his eyes burned with command. Pointed, we have 3. 1. Fortify Phoenix and withstand the assault. 2. Evacuate through supply tunnels to a secondary site. 3. Split half stay to delay, half escape. Ford muttered under his breath. Translation: 1 option kills us, 1 option starves us, and 1 option betrays us. Studied's face, calm, too calm. He already had a preference, and she wasn't sure it aligned with theirs. Burke crossed his arms, voice flat. We don't split, we stay together. Lane nodded, tension in his shoulders. If we divide, they pick us off, piece by piece. Stayed silent, her gaze fixed on the map. She traced the supply tunnels in her mind, imagining exits, choke points, fields of fire. Finally she spoke. If we stay, Phoenix falls. If we run blindly, we die tired. But if we make them believe we're still here while we vanish under their noses. His head lifted, he understood. A ghost exit. Nodded, explosives, decoys. Leave them fighting shadows while we disappear through the tunnels. Ford's grim smile returned. Now you're speaking my language. Preparations began immediately. Ford and Burke set charges along corridors, rigging walls to collapse after their exit. Lane rewired the comms to transmit looped chatter, making it sound as though squads were moving inside long after they'd gone. Found herself alone in the armory, hands moving mechanically as she checked magazines. 30 cal, 5.56, and the long heavy rounds for the. Each metallic click echoed like a heartbeat. She paused only once when she pulled out a picture from her vest pocket. A candid photo, her daughter at 16, hair tied back, smudged with paint from art class, smiling in a way hadn't seen in years. Her throat tightened. Will I live long enough to see her smile again? She slid the photo back carefully, as if protecting it might protect her. The first shells hit Phoenix before they were ready. Mortar fire arced from the desert, explosions tearing into the perimeter. Dust rained from the ceiling. The compound shook. Time up, Burke barked. The team moved, guiding through concrete tunnels that stank of fuel and rust. Emergency lights flickered overhead. Explosions rumbled above, each one closer, hungrier. Took rear guard, cradled, her ears straining for footsteps that weren't theirs. Every echo felt like a shadow chasing. Ford muttered ahead, voice tight with forced calm. Charges armed. Once they breach, Phoenix is theirs, but only for a minute. Said nothing. She focused on the path, one step at a time, one breath at a time. Half an hour into the tunnels, Lane froze at a junction. His radio crackled, faint but sharp. Unknown movement, corridor delta. Stomach sank, they weren't alone. Burke signaled hand to hand, silent advance, weapons ready. They crept forward, boots whispering on concrete. The tunnel narrowed, shadows swallowing corners. His heart slowed, her breathing measured. Through her scope, she scanned darkness, finger poised. A shape emerged, armed, moving low. She fired. The echo thundered through the tunnel, the body crumpled. Another figure bolted behind, then another. Not insurgents, Lane hissed. Gears wrong, these are. Contractors, finished, cold realization twisting her gut. Private military, American accents, faces hidden, uniforms stripped of flags, ghost soldiers. Proof that the betrayal wasn't abstract. It wore American boots. The firefight in the tunnel was claustrophobic. Muzzle flashes lit the dark. Bullets sparked against concrete. Dust filled lungs. His rifle spoke thunder, each shot shaking the narrow space. Ford hurled a charge, detonating the side wall, burying two contractors under rubble. Burke and Lane advanced with grim precision, covering as Cox dragged him to safety. When silence finally returned, his ears rang. The air stank of blood and burnt plastic. She stepped over bodies that could have been allies in another life, men who once swore the same oath she had. Her chest ached, not from exertion, but from something deeper. What are we becoming when we kill our own? She didn't speak it aloud. Some truths broke morale faster than bullets. At last the tunnel opened into desert night. Stars spread endless above. Cool air kissed their sweat-soaked skin. But freedom was fragile. Convoy headlights already danced on the horizon, sweeping like predators. Drones buzzed faintly overhead, their red eyes searching. His heart hammered, we need cover now. Burke pointed east. Dry canyon, 2 clicks if we move fast. No, cut in sharply. Her eyes were locked on the sky. Drones will track heat signatures. We'll never make it as a group. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. Rasp from his stretcher, voice barely audible but steady. Then we split, diversion teams, buy each other time. Burke started to protest, but eyes silenced him. This isn't a vote, it's survival. They split. Ford and Burke carried the heavier load east, rigging traps as they went. Lane and Cox stayed with, heading north under cover of jagged rocks. Moved alone, her only companion, shadows her only allies. She was the ghost now, the distraction, the whisper, the unseen. Her boots sank into sand, breath steady, every step calculated. She fired once, twice, carefully placed shots that drew headlights and searchlights away from the others. She became the phantom they wanted to chase. But as she moved deeper into the desert, alone and hunted, she felt something she hadn't let herself feel in years. Not fear, not anger. Loneliness. The kind that gnaws in silence, reminding you of every face you've left behind. She whispered into the night as though might hear her across an ocean. I'll come home, I swear. But even she didn't know if it was a promise or a prayer. Hours later, lay in a dry riverbed, the braced against her shoulder, watching headlights crawl across the desert floor like ants. Her body ached, her throat burned, her heart beat slow, steady, resigned. She had done her part, drawn the hunt, kept the others breathing. But in the vast silence of the desert, she wondered, how many times could she keep saving others before she ran out of herself? The stars gave no answer. And as dawn broke over the horizon, painting the sand blood-red, knew the war ahead wasn't just outside the wire. It was inside her. How long could a person survive alone in the desert? Didn't know the answer. She only knew the rhythm of her own footsteps, the drag of her rifle against her shoulder, and the ache that had settled deep in her chest. The sun had risen high, punishing and merciless. Heat shimmered across the sand, bending the horizon into a mirage of false promises. Her lips cracked. Sweat stung her eyes. Each swallow was a reminder of how little water she had left. Still she moved, because stopping wasn't an option. Every few hundred yards she dropped prone against her cheek, scanning for headlights, for dust clouds, for movement. The desert was alive with silence, and silence was dangerous. Memories pressed in harder than the heat. His face, 16 years old and already hardened by absence. The way she had refused to cry at the airport, but her hands had clenched into fists at her sides. "Why do you always go?" she asked. Hadn't answered, not then, because there was no answer a child could believe. Now, under the weight of an endless sky, whispered the truth she hadn't had the courage to say aloud. "Because if I don't, someone else's mother never comes home." The words evaporated into the desert, unheard, but the ache in her chest eased for a moment. By late afternoon, she found shelter in the ruins of an old mud-brick outpost, walls crumbling, roof half collapsed. It smelled of dust and rot, but the shadows gave her relief from the sun's relentless grip. She drank sparingly from her canteen, one swallow, two, enough to wet her throat, not enough to silence the burn. Her hands shook as she reloaded magazines. There was nearly empty. Sidearm down to 3 clips. She touched each round as though memorizing them, as though holding onto their weight might hold onto her will. A low hum broke the silence. Froze. She crawled to the edge of the ruin, peered out. A drone buzzed overhead, low and searching, its red light sweeping across sand. Her heart slammed. She pulled the closed scope locked on the machine. She could take it down, but the shot would give her away. She held her breath. The drone lingered, scanning before drifting past. Only when it was gone did she let the breath escape, shaky, ragged. Night came like a reprieve and a punishment. The desert cooled, stars sharp and endless above her. Lit no fire, moved no lights. She sat in the ruin, alone, rifle cradled, and listened to the weight of her own thoughts. That's when she heard them. Voices, low, foreign, carried by the wind. Shapes moving against starlight. Fighters, half a dozen at least, combing the desert with flashlights, weapons ready. His pulse quickened. She slid deeper into shadow, body pressed flat against the crumbling wall. They passed close, too close. One beam of light swept across her ruin, catching the edge of her boot. She fired. This thunder shattered the night. The fighter crumpled. Chaos erupted, shouts, muzzle flashes, bullets slamming into mud walls. Rolled, aimed, fired again. Another fell. But numbers pressed against her. Gunfire tore into the ruin, spraying fragments into her skin. Her ears rang, dust choking her lungs. She crawled to a gap in the back wall, slipped into the darkness of open desert and ran. Bullets chased her, voices howled. But she didn't stop. An hour later, she collapsed into a ravine, chest heaving, body screaming for rest. Blood trickled down her arm from a shallow graze. Her hands trembled as she pressed gauze against it, teeth clenched against pain. For a moment despair clawed at her, alone, hunted, wounded. But then she remembered smile, the rare, unguarded kind that lit her whole face. And knew she wasn't done, not yet. She whispered into the night, her voice raw, "Not today, you don't take me today." The next morning brought something unexpected. Tracks, boot prints in the sand. Recent, military issue, not militia. Crouched low, tracing them with her fingers. The stride was steady, disciplined. Whoever left them knew how to move through this land. For a heartbeat, hope flickered. Could it be Burke's group? Lane, Coxsworth. She followed. Hours passed, the trail winding toward a cluster of rocky hills. Her muscles ached, thirst clawed at her throat, but she kept moving. Then she saw them. 2 figures, armed, standing watch at a rocky pass. raised her scope, her breath caught. Not SEALs, not Americans, contractors, same gear as the tunnel. Her chest tightened. The tracks weren't leading her to safety. They were bait. She set up behind a boulder, rifle steady. She watched them for nearly an hour. They spoke little, their posture professional, their rifles clean and cared for. Not insurgents, not mercenaries looking for quick cash. These were trained, disciplined, paid well to do the work of ghosts. Thought of what it said, orchestration. Here it was, in flesh and blood. Her finger hovered on the trigger. She could take them both before they knew death was coming. But another thought gnawed at her. What if she let them live? What if she followed instead, saw where they went, learned who was giving the orders? The risk clawed at her mind. Kill them and stay safe, or shadow them and maybe learn the truth. She chose shadow. Hours passed as she tailed them, every nerve stretched taut. She moved from rock to rock, sand muffling her steps, her breath controlled. Finally, the contractors descended into a hidden canyon, crept to the ridge and froze. Below her lay a camp, vehicles, tents, comms gear humming, not insurgents, not army, something in between. A dozen contractors moved through routines with military precision, maps pinned under lanterns, drones recharging on makeshift pads, supply crates marked not with enemy sigils, but with American contractors' logos. Blood ran cold. It wasn't just betrayal. It was organized, funded, sanctioned by someone high enough to bury it under bureaucracy. And at the center of it all, standing over a map, was a face new. Her stomach twisted. Because it wasn't some shadow she couldn't name. It was Major Daniels, her old commanding officer. Memories hit hard. Daniels, strict, unyielding, the man who had once drilled into her the rules of survival, the cost of mistakes. The man who had signed off on her last deployment before was born. She had trusted him. Now here he was, orchestrating betrayal in the desert, calm as if planning training exercises. His grip tightened on her rifle. She could end it now. One round through the scope, justice in a heartbeat. But she froze. Because justice wasn't enough. Killing Daniels would silence him, but not the network, not the roots that ran deeper than any bullet could reach. She lowered the rifle. Her hands shook with rage, with betrayal, with something she couldn't name. And in that moment she realized her fight wasn't about surviving anymore. It was about exposing the truth. Night fell over the canyon and retreated to the ridge, mind racing. She could feel Photo pressing against her chest, could almost hear her daughter's voice asking, "When will you stop fighting, Mom?" Whispered her answer into the stars. When the truth is louder than their lies. She didn't sleep, she couldn't. Because dawn would bring choice. Stay hidden and watch, risk discovery and death, or strike now and gamble everything. Her hands trembled against her chest rose and fell with the weight of betrayal. And in the quiet before morning, she knew one thing with certainty. Her war was no longer theirs to command. It was hers. What was betrayal supposed to feel like? Thought it would be fire, anger burning through every nerve, rage hot enough to drown the pain. But lying on that ridge, steady in her hands, watching Major Daniels orchestrate betrayal like a conductor at his podium, it wasn't fire she felt. It was ice. Cold, heavy, unforgiving. She had trusted him once, trained under him, learned from him. Now he stood below, his voice calm as he directed contractors to spread maps across the hood of a Humvee. He pointed to grids, issued orders, shifted men like chess pieces. And somewhere out there, Burke, Ford, Lane, Cox, and were still fighting to stay alive. Not knowing that one of their own leaders had signed their death warrants. Lowered the rifle slowly, her muscles trembling. A single shot could end Daniels, but it wouldn't end this. Truth wasn't a bullet. Truth was a fire that needed witnesses to burn. And so she waited. Hours passed, shadows lengthened. The camp settled into a rhythm, guards rotating, generators humming, radios crackling faintly. Daniels disappeared into a command tent, its canvas walls glowing faintly with lamplight. His heart pounded. This was her chance. She crept down the ridge under cover of darkness, every step measured. Sand shifted softly under her boots, fabric brushed against stone. Her breath came shallow, her pulse steady in her ears. She moved like a ghost. At the camp's edge, she paused. Guards smoked near vehicles, rifles slung lazily. Their laughter floated faintly through the night. Too casual, too sure of their safety. Slipped past them, weaving between shadows, crouching low beside stacked crates. Each step felt like walking along a blade's edge. Her destination was clear, the comms tent. If she could record, intercept, capture even fragments of Daniel's orders, it would be proof. Proof that betrayal wasn't paranoia. It was real. Proof worth dying for. Inside the tent, glowing screens bathed the space in pale light. Radios buzzed. Paper maps covered tables. His hands shook as she slipped a flash drive from her pouch. She plugged it into the console, her breath shallow, praying the system didn't demand codes beyond her reach. Lines of text scrolled across the screen. Transmissions, logs, orders marked confidential U.S. command. Her throat tightened. It was all here. Routes of compromised teams, target coordinates disguised as recon points, payment records linked to shell companies, dozens of operations buried in false language, all ending the same, elite units sent into ambushes they never walked out of. She everything, every word. And then voices outside. Froze, ears straining, boots crunched near the tent, two men talking low. Daniels wants a sitrep in 10. Can't believe they're buying this cover story. Friendly fire, they'll swallow it whole. Their laughter was a knife. Slid beneath the table in hand, heart pounding. Shadows passed the tent's entrance. One lingered, the flap shifting slightly. For a breathless eternity she pictured it. Discovery, gunfire, her blood staining canvas. But then footsteps faded, the flap closed. Exhaled slowly, chest tight. Her flash drive blinked, a signal the download was complete. She pulled it free, tucking it into her vest like it was her heartbeat. But she wasn't done. She needed to hear him. Daniels, not whispers, not subordinates, his voice, his intent. So she slipped from the comms tent, hugging shadows until she reached the command tent. Inside, Daniels spoke, his voice measured, clinical. Phase 2 begins tomorrow. By dusk, their escape routes are cut. Survivors will be reported as MIA. Compensation channels remain secure. Another voice answered, familiar, chilling. Stomach dropped. The man who had promised protection at Phoenix stood beside Daniels like an ally, not an opponent. Phoenix was too costly, said flatly. Next time, isolate before engaging. Clean, contained, no witnesses. Daniels nodded, and the SEAL survivors. A pause, then expendable. His blood turned to ice. Her team wasn't just a casualty of war. They were a line item, disposable. Her hand tightened on the script. She could end it now. Daniels and both. But again, truth wasn't a bullet, not tonight. She slipped back into darkness. Didn't sleep. She crawled miles from the camp, body screaming with fatigue, but her mind sharper than it had ever been. The flash drive weighed against her chest, heavier than the rifle on her back. Proof, enough to burn the lies down. But proof was only power if it reached the right ears. And right now, every channel was poisoned. She needed the others. Needed Burke's iron steadiness, Lane's technical skill, Cox's medical calm, Ford's explosive improvisation. She needed not just as commander, but as the man who still carried weight with people who mattered. She needed her family back. At dawn, she spotted them. Moving carefully through a canyon, silhouettes against the rising sun. Burke in the lead, Ford covering rear, Lane scanning skis, Cox steady with strap to a makeshift stretcher. His throat tightened. Relief almost buckled her knees. She signaled with her scope's reflection, a quick flash against stone. Burke froze, rifle snapping up. Then his face softened when he saw her. Minutes later, they were together again. Ford clasped her shoulder hard, his voice gruff. "Thought we'd lost you." Swallowed, forcing words past the lump in her throat. "Not yet." They gathered in the canyon's shade, handed Lane the flash drive. His eyes widened as he scanned files on his handheld. This is everything. Payments, orders, ops, Christ, Daniels, and they're running the whole damn network. Cox's jaw clenched. So Phoenix was never rescue, it was disposal. Pale but alert, looked at, his voice was weak but certain. "You brought us proof, you bought us time, now we fight to make it mean something." Burke nodded, grim determination settling over him. "We leak this, we blow their game wide open. But how?" His answer came quiet, steady. "Not through their channels, they control those. We take it to the only place they can't bury, straight to the ground. Journalists, outsiders, people who don't answer to flags or ranks." The idea hung heavy, dangerous, but also right. Closed his eyes briefly, then opened them with a weary smile. Sometimes the only way to save a country is to remind it of its shame. But there was no time to plan further. Distant engines echoed across the desert. The hunt wasn't over. Burke scanned, the eyes narrowing. "They're still on us, we move now." Tightened her grip on the flash drive was safe, but for how long? As they prepared to move, she glanced back toward the horizon where Daniels' camp still slept under morning haze. Her voice was a whisper, a promise. "You taught me survival, Major, but you forgot one lesson: survivors remember, and survivors speak." She adjusted her pack, steadied her rifle, and fell in with the team. Because the truth was heavier than any weapon she'd ever carried. And she would carry it until her last breath. What did survival mean if the truth never saw daylight? Had asked herself that question 100 times in the last 48 hours. Each time the answer shifted. Sometimes survival was just another mission. Sometimes it was a prayer whispered into sand. But now, as dawn burned the desert gold and the roar of engines echoed closer, she knew survival meant something else. It meant keeping the flash drive alive. It meant keeping the story alive. Because stories could outlive bullets. The team moved fast, weaving through canyons, sand crunching under their boots. Was pale on the stretcher, but his eyes remained sharp, watching them, guiding them with nods and short commands. Burke scouted ahead, hand signals sharp as knives. Ford lagged back, rigging small charges as breadcrumbs for their pursuers. Lane carried the handheld like it was oxygen, the files glowing faint on the cracked screen. Stayed at the flank, pressed tight against her shoulder, scanning ridges, shadows, horizons. Every sound was a threat, every silence worse. She thought again of, would her daughter ever know why her mother kept going? Would she understand the difference between war fought for protection and war fought for lies? His throat tightened. One day she'll know, if I make it that far. The first clash came at midday. Contractors swept into the canyon like wolves, their vehicles kicking up dust, their rifles disciplined and merciless. The SEALs ducked into cover, rocks, crevices, anything that might shield them. Gunfire erupted, echoing off canyon walls. Brace thee on a ledge, scope locking on. One round, then another vehicle screeched, tires shredded, bodies dropped into the dust. Each shot was thunder, each echo her promise that they would not be erased quietly. Ford detonated his charges, collapsing a ridge behind them, trapping half the pursuers in smoke and rubble. But more kept coming. Lane hissed into his headset, static biting his words. "They're tracking us by heat, always one step ahead." His gut twisted. The hunters had learned. They weren't improvising anymore, they were tightening the noose. By dusk, they reached a dried riverbed. Exhaustion clung to every step but insisted they stop, just long enough to catch breath, to think, to be more than prey. The team huddled in the shallow trench, dust caking their faces, silence broken only by shallow breaths. Burke finally spoke, voice low. "We can't keep running, not like this." Ford wiped blood from his cheek. "So we make a stand." Lane shook his head. "A stand is death, proof dies with us, we need another way." All eyes turned too. She didn't want the weight of it, but it was hers anyway. "We split again," she said quietly, "but this time by purpose. One team takes in the drive, the other draws fire." Silence followed, heavy, final. Cox broke it first, voice steady. "I'll take. I've kept him alive this far. I'll keep him alive longer." Burke nodded. "I go with them." Ford gave a humorless grin. "Guess that means I'm with the ghost again." His chest tightened, but she gave the faintest nod. Lane looked at her, searching, maybe hoping she'd say something different, but she didn't. Sometimes survival wasn't fair. Night fell, and the teams separated under cover of stars. And Ford slipped west, shadows in the sand, rifles ready. They fired sporadically, drawing the hunt their way. Headlights and gunfire chased them, swallowing the silence of the desert. Cox, Burke, and Lane moved north, every step carrying the drive closer to a chance at daylight. It was a gamble, a sacrifice. But sacrifices were what wars were made of. Hours bled into a blur, and Ford ran, fought, disappeared into shadows, emerged again in thunder. At one point, Ford laughed between bursts of gunfire, the sound ragged but alive. "Hell of a way to die, huh?" Didn't smile, she only reloaded. "We're not dying yet." But deep inside, she wasn't sure if she believed her own words. The climax came at dawn, and Ford had taken shelter in a rocky outcrop, their ammunition nearly gone. The contractors closed in, disciplined, methodical. Ford wiped sweat from his brow, looked at her with a kind of peace. "I'll hold them. You take you keep moving." Shook her head sharply. "We hold together." Ford's grin was tired but true. "Not this time. Someone gotta give them hell while you give them silence." Before she could stop him, he rose from cover, firing wildly, his voice a roar against the desert. Bullets tore into him, his body jerking, but he kept firing, kept screaming until the sound cut off. His chest cracked open with grief, but she moved. Because his death bought her seconds, and seconds were everything. She ran. Sand tore at her boots, the heavy but steady in her hands. Bullets sparked around her, dust clouds blooming. She dove into a ravine, heart pounding, lungs burning. The contractors swarmed above, their shouts echoing. Braced, the scope locking on. Her vision tunneled, her world shrinking to crosshairs and breath. She fired once, twice, 3 times. Bodies dropped, engines died. But there were always more. Always. Then an explosion. Far to the north, a plume of fire rising against the horizon. His heart stopped. Was it Cox's team, the drive? She didn't know. But she knew this. The truth was out there, fragile and burning. And if it had survived that blast, if it had reached even one honest hand, then none of this was for nothing. She whispered to herself, voice raw, "Please, let it live." By midday, she was alone again. The desert stretched endless, her body broken, her ammunition nearly gone. She collapsed beside a boulder, across her lap, sun blazing overhead. Her vision blurred, her breath slowed. For a moment, she wondered if this was the end. But then she thought of, and she smiled. Because even if her story ended here, would one day learn the truth. Not the sanitized version, not the official report. The truth her mother had carried across fire and betrayal and silence. And maybe that was enough. She closed her eyes, letting the desert hum around her. In her final clarity, she thought not of war, not of betrayal, not of the faces of men she'd lost or killed. She thought of dignity, and how sometimes dignity didn't speak. It simply acted,